last session, which is on Hinduism. So we will have four speakers. Once again, with John, followed by Franz Amir, and then followed by Dr. Kishore, and then followed by Saraj. Okay.
Okay.
So
do I have to do anything on this?
well, you want to scroll down, or John will take the floor now.
Okay. Dr. Kishore, nice to see you. I see that we share the addition of some facial hair.
I'm delighted
Oh.
to be here. I wanted to
Can-
come in
is this
person, but
better?
I couldn't. due
Is
to
this better?
compelling
Can you hear me?
circumstances.
So, Dr. Kishore, nice to see you and your beard. I think we share this development. Can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I can
Suraj,
hear you.
Dr.
Yeah,
Kishore, can you hear me?
yeah, I can hear you. I'm
No,
pleased to
you're
be
over
here.
there. I know you're not, you're in here. I just saw you over here.
Can you hear me, please?
It's the metaverse, exactly. Okay, Dennis, can you hear me? I'm just checking with our friends over there.
Yeah,
I
yes,
don't know
sir.
where they
Yes,
are.
we can.
Okay, so I'm going to start by just pointing out something about the Hindu tradition, which is, or the tradition of texts in the subcontinent, is that they're all over the place. And so, you know, there are these Sanskrit texts about meditation and this and that. There's also a canonical text on politics, the Arthashastra tradition. And in that tradition, religion, or whatever you want to call it, the monks and the institutions are entirely instrumentalized. You know, if you need a spy or you want to do some spying, it's always sometimes useful to use monks and other members of the clergy or something, because people trust them. And so from the point of view of the state, religion is this thing that goes on over there that's useful. As we come forward, things change quite a bit. Well, I just wanted to point that out as a kind of basis, a grounding basis. Now, what the text means. So we're going to hear a lot about the text says this and the text says that, and there's some holy thing over there and a God doing this, that, and just keep in mind that the textual tradition, the Sanskrit textual tradition, is quite diverse, and it includes this kind of blunt political instrumentalization of the religious order, or what we would call the religious order. So Hinduism is, you know, I think a relatively new concept. Prior to about 200 years ago, there was a notion of Hindustan. It was kind of a geographical thing. There were occasional references to what it means, something called Hindu, but by and large, it was not a widespread idea. And it didn't really become one until it became necessary for the British colonial overlords to sort of hash out who these people are, which they call the Hindus with Hindu law, and the Muslims with Muslim law, and the Jains with Jain law. The British wanted to rule with some Western rationality. That's why Hinduism is a little wonky, and why I argue here that ultimately what that means is that the people who claim to be defining Hinduism, in a sense, are defining it. I mean, so Modi and BJP have taken over the discourses about Hinduism, and they are defining Hinduism in a certain way. Now, what's a kind of lesson I want to take from that and convey to you is that what this means is that if I'm gonna do the backstory in just a second, but if Hinduism now is a state religion, Hindutva, you know, it's this national religion, And you have the merging of national interest or state interest with, so-called religious interests. I think that this is an import from the Christian West to view things like that. It's not entirely a clean thing to say that. There are exceptions here and there. But I'm not the only person to say that. But what that means is that if we are seeking to identify norms, religious norms of some kind, that can be used to control the activities of man on the face of the planet, which by all accounts, I think we all agree, just witness climate change, among other things, are quite profound. The human activities have had a profound effect on whatever nature is. Nature in any of the different ways that y'all have described it, all of which have some utility in this kind of discussion. If that's the case, that the state, the modern state, now this is a modern state. The states that we have are not like these things that were, excavated from 5,000 years ago and somehow made their way forward. And we've always had states. We haven't had states like we have now. They're quite different. If that's the case, and if the religion is identified with the state, then, and we're looking for norms of some kind, then we have to look at the normative environment of the state, which I think in some ways, Somali's points are sort of circle around this idea or are right on point with it. And if that's the case, states now exist in the international legal order. The UN is the focus or locus of international order. We have many human rights documents and other documents that are agreed on by the international community, but we focus, let's just say, on the two covenants, the ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil Political Rights, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights. India has signed on these things, for instance, and therefore those norms, those international norms, coalesce with national norms and whatever the state says religion is to be the normative environment that we would look to if we say, okay, what is the contribution of Hinduism to dealing with the environment in India? You'd have to look to all of those things. The Indian Constitution is in theory the kind of expression of these things. It was written, very explicitly to be non-partisan, non-religious, a secular kind of constitution, but it's no longer that, right? There's some states in India which don't follow Modi and are not so influenced by BJP, but most of India is, and the BJP policies have to be adjudged by international norms and national norms. Father Samir points out that Modi is going into the international community and saying, oh, we want to be leaders of the international environmental, ecological saviors and whatever. And that may be so. But on the ground in India, because of the other problem that we face, if we sort of move in this direction, then it opens the door to talk about the influence of transnational corporations and oligarchies, because they profoundly distort any normative order, not to mention corruption, because they produce corruption. And they act with regard to, for the most part, solely with regard to their bottom line. And so we have, what is the religion of Hinduism? It's something to do with the Indian state now. It has to do with these international and national norms. It has to do with oligarchies influencing collective behavior and individual behavior. And I think that's our context. you know, and I think we all have to, if we're realistic about it, we can enunciate, you know, oh, yes, you know, if we're in the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, there's God, everything, you know, God made creation, therefore there's some line of reasoning that says it's good because of that. And therefore we have duties or rights or whatever with regard to creation. Or on the other side, you have the Taoist point of view or Buddhist point of view, or, you know, some Sanskrit kind of point of view in which gets very confused because it's conceptually very difficult to deal with ideas like Maya or Prakriti, which is in Sanskrit nature. I think Taoism seems to kind of be the best language for addressing some of these issues, but you know, it can get exceedingly complicated if we're looking for norms to look to these pure traditions, right? I mean, we come here in a sense and we present a pure position, a Catholic position, an Orthodox position, you know, Theravadan position or whatever, but these positions don't exist in purity, right? Maybe in some individuals they do, but collectively, collective religious activities are not, I think Somali makes a point, collective activities in the name of religions are inherently political. And I think that there's something accurate and very problematic for our discussion about that. I think we have to deal with it. It's not that we're not dealing with it, or I don't, you know, 5 minutes, I got 5 minutes. Okay, where did this problem come from? So Father Samir and I have been talking about this. I'm just going to now kind of discuss modernity very briefly, because modernity is an intellectual process that kind of intervenes in the history of ideas, starting roughly in the Enlightenment and moving forward through philosophical and political texts, and through on the ground through colonial activities, right? And through, you know, other kinds of wars and so on. And that it's a set of ideas that is very changed things quite profoundly. And it has two parts. One piece is what we call science, and one piece is contemporary political theory. Statism based on individuals, contract state theory, you know, Hobbes and Kant and Rawls. That line of thinking is one line. The other thing is science. And what does science say? Science is materialistic. The only thing that's real is the concrete stuff. If you look at the world to understand it, you don't look to ideas. That's scholasticism, Aristotelianism, and this has already come up once. You look to things and then you induce from things. We don't like deduction anymore because deduction is associated with Aristotle and other weird things. So, and the church. So this set of ideas, this very secular set of ideas, which is, I think we agree, there's some agreement, not with David Barr. Where's David? Anyway, David's paper, you know, was responding to somebody. He said no. His interlocutor, White, said, I think it's White is his name, right? Christianity started the whole problem through science or something. And Barr says, well, it's racist and it's got all kinds of problems. I mean, I don't agree with White's argument. I think White's argument is not very nuanced, but it does. Science has its historical and philosophical roots in Christian idea of reality, and it then all this cluster of ideas, desacralized ideas, although the priests come along with the colonial ships into the other territories. This changes every one of us, every one of the ancient traditions profoundly, right? Buddhism is profoundly changed. Islam profoundly changed. The traditions in China profoundly changed. China is a Marxist state, a Marxist scientific state. That's one of the largest, China is, they're serious stuff. Marxist. And so on. I mean, there are just a few large traditions like I didn't address Africa as another set of issues, but we don't exist in a pure way anymore. None of us do because of modernity. And even if we don't like modernity, it's extremely complicated to philosophically back out of it because people say, oh, you can't do that, or that's not real or whatever. So how do we do that? How do we digest modernity? For a religious tradition, I have 1 minute, it's very complicated. And it's very, it's like, the horse is out of the barn or whatever. It's happened. We can't go back. So what do we do with our purity? How do we turn it into something that has legs, that hits, where does the rubber hit the road when we live in a modern world, a world that we don't define anymore, and we can't, because how reality is defined now is really complicated. It's not as simple as it used to be before the modern world developed. End of story. Thank you.
Very good. So I am going to try and respond to John's very challenging and I think thought-provoking paper. The challenge, of course, is that John's paper has less to do, or at least immediately at first impression, is less to do with Hinduism's approach to ecology and more to do with the nature and identity of religion, the relationship between religion and politics, and what constitutes Hinduism, right? And so here we're focused on fundamental issues that have been sort of behind the scenes, not only in this workshop, but also in past workshops on areas that have to do with philosophy of religion, history of religion, the history of philosophy. And so in a certain sense, that's going to be the context of the argument today. If I had to summarize John's argument in 4 theses, it seems to be the following. First, that our notion of religion is a 19th century. Is a 19th century European colonial academic concept that to a certain extent is modeled on Christianity and especially on Catholicism. This new notion of religion is then imposed upon the different existing ethical sovereigns through the process of colonialism, which then changes them definitively. And Hinduism is the fruit of that process in India. And to a certain extent, therefore, its creation is coextensive with the creation of the Indian state. So when this workshop asks about Hinduism's approach to ecology, we have to look at current government policies and not at the classical texts of the Indian tradition. And to that extent, Modi's India, Modi, of course, for those who don't know, is the current Prime Minister of India. Modi's India has nothing of value to say on the environment, and in fact ranks at the very bottom of the Yale 2022 Environmental Performance Index. That's, as I have understood it, the core of John's argument. And I'm simply going to offer some reflections on each of these 4 theses. And now, okay, there we go. Now, his first thesis is essentially the invention of world religions. This phrase is taken from an extremely important and influential book in 2005 by Masuzawa entitled The Invention of World Religions. And the thesis essentially is that the concept of religion that we have today is a 19th century invention in Europe that allowed the Europeans to do two things, sorry. On the one hand, to compartmentalize their own religion, their own religious history, Christianity, as something private and therefore unimportant when shaping public policy. And at the same time, to justify the colonial conquest of those cultures that were still supposedly enslaved by religious superstition, which Europe had freed itself from because of the Enlightenment. Now, my response to this is essentially one of agreement. In my paper, I outline 4 authors. The list can be extended, who are the fathers, in some sense, of modernity or of the Enlightenment, of Aufklärung. Francis Bacon, an Englishman, Vico, an Italian, Kant and Schleiermacher, who are Germans. I'm not going to get into the details of what each of them said over here for lack of time. What is the fundamental change or the fundamental concept? The Christian notion of a kingdom of God is changed into that of a kingdom of man, which is identified or which is characterized as dominion over creation. The dominion over creation that was given to man by God. That word already is problematic, okay? But that original dominion, stewardship, whatever you want to call it, given by God to man, which was then lost through original sin, is now to be reestablished and perfected through science, technology, and politics. And religion, and in the first place, Christianity, is entirely divorced from knowledge and action and limited instead to the world of feeling and sentiment. This is the contribution of Friedrich Schleiermacher, who's responding to Kant, but who essentially adopts a Kantian perspective in his response. Reason is now supreme, but reason is understood in an entirely phenomenological sense and therefore has no access to metaphysical truths and no access to God. So religion can have nothing to do with reason any longer. Reason is entirely autonomous. So where do we place religion? We place it entirely in the realm of feeling and sentiment. And therefore religion is entirely private and subjective. It has no authority over science, technology, and politics, which alone have the task of creating the new world, the kingdom of God on man or on earth, the kingdom of man. Okay? So you have the construction of a human utopia with an effective divinization of man. We've talked a lot here about anthropocentrism, etc. I would argue that this is an exaggerated anthropocentrism, where man has taken the position of God and where man can now establish through reason, through science, through technology, and through politics, the perfect society on earth. And if you want, well, I'll get back to that. Okay. To what extent is that modeled on Christianity? I won't get into too many details over here. I simply want to point out that there is a profoundly distorting effect on Christianity itself because of this vision, okay? John talks in his paper about the traditions that he's more familiar with, which is the distorting effect of this notion, this new notion of religion on Islam and on the Indian traditions and on the Chinese traditions. There's a terribly distorting and destructive and deforming effect on Christianity itself, okay? If anyone is familiar with the work of perhaps the greatest theologian, not a Catholic theologian, a Reformed theologian, Karl Barth, in the 20th century, who was actually called the greatest theologian of the 20th century by none other than Pope John the 23rd, who launched the Second Vatican Council. His entire work is to combat the effect of what he calls religionism on Protestant Christianity. And if you want an emblem, a symbol of how profound this change was, in 1793, after the French Revolution, so in the height of the Enlightenment, Catholic churches in France, Notre Dame Cathedral, was changed, transformed from a Christian or Catholic church into a temple dedicated to reason, with the new God being reason, and with worship of this God being able to construct now the perfect society. That's the effect on Christianity. I'm not an expert in the history of Indian thought, Islamic thought, and Chinese thought. John argues in his paper, and I'm fundamentally in agreement with him, that a very similar sort of distorting effect, deforming effect occurred in these other traditions because of colonialism and because of the imposition of this new idea of reason, the worship of reason, on these other traditions. Okay, I simply suggest that perhaps instead of the total discontinuity, radical discontinuity, perhaps there are also elements of continuity between pre and post-colonial forms of Hinduism, Islam, Chinese, and as it is in Christianity. Okay, there are authors, for example, like King and Hedges, who have responded to Masusawa, saying that instead of talking about the invention of world religions, we should talk about their discovery. To me, invention exaggerates the discontinuities. Discovery exaggerates the continuity. Okay, probably, and you'd have to then get an expert in the history of each of these traditions to determine to what extent the particular tradition has changed as a result of the encounter with modernity. Okay. The question then is, does the classical Indian tradition, in its pre-colonial form, have anything to say, anything of value to say about the ecological problem? Hypothetically, if there were some sort of continuity, can we look to these original texts for some sort of wisdom and guidance and orientation? Okay, and this, in a certain sense, is the goal of Dr. Kishore's paper, who's going to present after me. My response is, and we've talked about this in the last workshop in Morocco, there are two groups of texts, the moksha texts on the ultimate nature of reality, and the dharma texts on right behavior, and together with that, we can talk about Puranic texts and Bhakti texts. My argument is that moksha teachings on the ultimate nature of reality, on cosmic oneness, on escape from the cycle of rebirth, okay, have little to do with actual right behavior, with dharma requirements in this life. And we heard from Paul. I was very pleased to discover that Paul cited the same article that I cite in my paper, which is Nelson, that even Advaita non-dualism at the moksha level actually could be interpreted as encouraging attitudes of devaluation and neglect of the natural world. Okay, so the moksha texts are ambiguous. What about the Puranic and Bhakti texts and the Dharma texts? Now, it's true that we have general principles and motivations and mythical stories that encourage attitudes of a holy reverence towards the earth. But I would argue that that evidence remains fragmentary and open to even diametrically contradictory interpretations. Above all, when it comes to choosing between competing goods and establishing concrete environmental safeguards and practices. And I'll give you an example. I'm sure Dr. Kishore will mention, and it's true, that in traditional Hinduism, popular Hinduism, Prithvi or Mother Earth is considered a goddess, Prithvi. And so that's a certain attitude of reverence to the earth because she's divine. But at the same time, Lakshmi is considered the goddess of wealth. And at least for many people, Lakshmi is more important than Prithvi. So in concrete, when someone has to choose between personal wealth and respect for the environment, it's not clear within the Hindu tradition that you actually have to give more importance to the environment, because you're more beholden in a certain sense to give reverence and respect to Lakshmi, the goddess of personal wealth, and therefore to pursue that, right? I give more examples in my paper, but the point is that here's my first conclusion, that the Western Enlightenment fanaticized ideological belief in the ability and destiny of man to dominate and perfect nature through science, technology, and politics, and to thus establish an immanent kingdom of God. And that this attitude certainly has much to answer for when it comes to the current ecological situation. But we should at the same time avoid the temptation to exaggeratedly romanticize the ecological import of the pre-colonial message of the Indian traditions in our search for a convincing solution to that problem. Okay. That brings me to the last thesis or the last part of John's argument on Modi's India. It's true, well, I assume it's true if the Yale report is accurate, that India falls at the very bottom of all these ecological indicators. Okay, my hope my response is that there's some hope, even if of the weakest and most cautious variety, for change on the ecological front in India. But why? And this might get me into trouble if we ever go back to India. But anyway, it's based on Modi's obsessive longing to present India as a model nation to the global community. His craving to prove the superiority of the Hindu ideal to all competing models and proposals, including in the environmental sector. And I'll give you an example of this. So in 2021 in Glasgow, Modi famously launched the Life movement, Lifestyle for the Environment movement, with the goal of promoting a global environment conscious lifestyle. Now, in and of itself, that's very good. That's very positive, right? To combat over-consumerism and over-consumption. And what was interesting was the justification given for that in the official, the document that came out from the Indian government. And it says that India's rich traditional wisdom and climate-friendly practices make us the best placed to assume a leadership role in driving behavior change on the climate action. Right? Last slide. I am not capable of answering whether India is doing all that it can on the ecological front. And I am certainly not capable of answering what criteria can and should be used to compare India's advances with that of other countries in this battle, right? The whole debate about developing countries, developed countries, etc. I'm not the person to ask about those problems. But I am certain that the Modi regime will continue to actively seek the prestige that comes from presenting itself as a leader in the battle to protect the environment, and that it will explicitly couch this as motivated and inspired by Hindu values and teachings, even if I think that foundation is rather tenuous. Only time will tell how profound, how lasting, and how successful the actual efforts behind this claim truly are. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Now, next speaker is from.
This slide displays the fundamental thought of Hinduism, that is cosmic oneness. In Sanskrit, we say Tat Tvam Asi. There are three words combined together into one. Tat means you, Tat means that, Tvam means you, Asi means are. So this means that you are, or you are that. So there is no difference between all that crystallizes in the nature, whether it is sentient or insentient. All are microcosm and macrocosm are same. This is the basic Indian thought. Now the next slide I display is that entire humanity is one family. I am Nija Param Veti Garna Lagu Chet Sam Vitar Charita Nam Tu Vasudev Kutumbakam. That person is my own, and the other one is not my own, is a thinking of small-heartedness. For the generous ones, the entire humanity is one family. Now the next slide is Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinam Sarve Santu Niramaya Sarve Bhadrani Pashyanti Ma Kashit Dugbhag Bhavet. May all be happy, may all be free from disease, may all look for the good of others, may no one suffer. Now we perceive earth as a mother. This is written in our Atharva Veda, which was written about 2000 years ago. And the shlok says, in your center, O Mother Earth, is your navel, from which the vital powers emanate and spread out, absorb us in that power and purify us. O Bhumi Mata. Bhumi Mata means Mother Earth. I am the son of Mother Earth. And rain God is my father. Maybe fill us with vital power and water. Now, this is one of the shlokas in Bhagavad Gita, which says, I am the super consciousness that resides in all living beings. I am the beginning, the middle, and the end of all creatures. Now, this is a slide showing how we worship the rivers. Millions and millions of people gather on the river Ganges and they worship the river as their mother. Now, average Hindus worship the trees also, because trees are also a part of the same cosmic consciousness as we are. Then another worship is the animal. We worship the animal also. Now, this is a Hindu doctrine, non-possessiveness, known as aparigraha, is the virtue of non-possessiveness or non-greediness. According to this philosophy, no one owns anything in the nature. All territories and elements are common heritage. One can take only as per his or her bare requirement. While studying the Judeo-Christian thought, I found one verse 1.26 in the book of Genesis in Old Testament, and that I have projected in this slide. And God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and all over the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. The above revelation notwithstanding, some Western thinkers like Ronald Simpkins do not agree with this anthropocentric connotation and argue that human and all other creatures are dependent upon God for creation and subsistence. All are alike, are valuable to God as part of his creation. The world, inclusive of humans and animals, trees and plants, land and seas, belong to God because it is the God's creation and it is in relation to God that each part of creation has its value. The German philosopher Martin Heidegger is very close to Indian thought. Heidegger's expression in his book, Being and Time, treating subject and object as inseparable, is rewardingly similar to what is said in Bhagavad Gita, which I displayed in the slide. The entire discourse, therefore, needs assimilation of Oriental wisdom and Western thought in order to ensure synergism and complementarity with the nature. And in fact, it has been long overdue. We ought to realize that all religions are rooted in human virtues, and despite variations in their approaches, aim at an enlightened and human social order. The challenge is how to transform the religious narratives into action. Unless the religious values are incorporated in everyday life, they are of no avail. The people who worship rivers and trees have been polluting and uprooting them. The people who talk of animal rights have been killing them indiscriminately. The reformists who exhaust their lives to save the earth are written off as small-minded Luddites resisting progress. Mahatma Gandhi, the father of my nation, who taught his countrymen to weave their own clothes, has been forgotten in his homeland while framing policies. His name is confined to academic discussions and is often used as a slogan to win credibility and mass support. True anthropocentricity must include concern for nature. The laws must reflect a global responsibility. At the moment, the burden of global warming in terms of environment, economic, and migratory impacts is being felt most heavily by nations which contributed the least to ecological degradation. It is important to ascribe liability to entities which supported environmentally destructive strategies in these places. Most of the world's unsustainable increase in global temperatures was produced by wealthy industrialized countries in Europe and North America. These countries should feel an ethical responsibility towards climate-impacted people. Cries through skin-deep strategies marked by international declarations and resolutions are of no consequence. Consumerism and commercialization are intractable traits, and the perpetrators need to be handled sternly. Thank you very much.
Saurabh?
Thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you.
I would like to respond to Professor Kishore's paper. Well, I remember that Joseph asked us to imagine, for those who are commenting on Arthur's papers, Joseph asked us to imagine that we are walking into a temple belonging to another tradition. And I did just that. And I imagined myself walking into a Hindu temple. It sounds so familiar because Thai people received a lot of cultural influences from India. And walking into a Hindu temple is just like walking into a Thai temple nowadays, because both traditions are all mixed up. My point is that this response from the Buddhist standpoint is more like a conversation in the same kind of big umbrella tradition, which is the Indian religious tradition. In any case, I am presenting the Buddhist viewpoint in response to Professor Kishore's emphasis on the ancient text and how the Buddhists, Buddhist being a diverse tradition. So a Buddhist such as myself might respond to that. Before we go on, this is just it is the news. Just happened a few hours ago. There's a leak of chemicals, kind of very nasty chemicals, not too far from here. It's in Nakhon Pathom, which is about 20-30 kilometers west of here, is west of Bangkok. And it caused a lot of nasty smell all over. So much so that schools in the area need to close today and tomorrow. So authorities are investigating the incidents, and tomorrow, the day after, we might learn more about what happened actually. And my point is that we are not talking about ancient texts or deep philosophical concepts which are abstract. We are talking about what is actually happening. It's just essentially next door. This hotel is located on the west side of the Chao Phraya River, and further west for 20-30 kilometers is just this factory where there is this big chemical leak. So just to remind ourselves, and we have heard many of us talk about, we should emphasize more on the really on the political and the active aspect. I cannot agree more. But I think being philosophers, not people in the government, I think what we do best is to reflect on how best to justify and how to theorize, how to find a link between the ancient texts and the ancient traditions that we belong to and the contemporary problems such as this one and such as global warming and so on. So just to put us into the context of what is happening. Commenting on Professor Kishore, Buddhism, as I said, and Hinduism came from the same root. The differences between the two, on the other hand, well, the point is that when we look at the differences tend to be between Buddhism and Hinduism on the one hand, and the monotheistic tradition on the other, at least when it comes to creation stories. And this is the familiar story that we all know about, the story that put a clear picture on the position of human being in nature, right? However, there are creation stories both in Hinduism and in Buddhism. And when we look at these creation stories, we can find some interesting aspect on the points of view of these two traditions, which are sister traditions, essentially, on the position of human being in nature. The creation story in Buddhism is less known. In Hinduism, there is this well-known story of the origin of the god Brahma being born from the navel of the god Vishnu. Vishnu was lying under the sea, and when the right time comes, something happened, and then Brahma kind of emerges out of on a lotus, and the stem of the lotus arises from the navel of Vishnu. And then after that, Brahma goes on with the responsibility, with the task of creating everything. And it goes on in a cycle. So that is the familiar story in Hinduism. Professor Kishore might elaborate on that or correct me on that story. However, I would like to bring your attention to the creation story in Buddhism, which comes from a well-known, at least among Buddhist scholars, discourse called Akanya Sutta. It's a story. The Buddha doesn't tell a story much. Most often in his teaching, he just presents the teaching, which are answers to questions or explanations of points where he was asked by one of his disciples and so on. But in this sutta, in this discourse, he encountered some Brahmins, and after some conversation with the history of those Brahmins, why they came to see the Buddha and so on, he tells them this story. The story is about the origin of Earth and everything, where there are, I don't know whether they are celestial beings, but they are beings, they are quite formless, and they reside in some primordial reality. And after that, there is an expansion and contraction of cosmos, of everything, resulting in there being a kind of a curve. You look at how Indian people produce cheese out of milk. They churn the milk. The milk becomes more coagulated, more like hardened. That is the metaphor for the cosmos being hardened, some solid stuff appearing on the surface. And these beings somehow got a taste of these curds, and they like the curds so much that they become kind of identified with the curd. So they become materialized, and they fall from their original state. And to cut the story short, they become like us, like human beings. So it's a story of a fall, which is comparable in one way or another to the Judeo-Christian story of the fall and the origin of us human beings. But the point is that the cause of the fall belongs to the beings themselves, in the sense that it is their craving, their material desire for the exquisite taste of the curd that brings them down from their primordial original state down to our own present state, where we have to work for living and so on. So what is the point of this story concerning the environment? The point is that human relation with nature and the position of human being within nature is a result of human beings, or the primordial beings, fall from their blessed state, original state, due to their material desire. So time goes very fast. So it is our material desire that creates the world that we know of. So it's a very Buddhist thing to say. So the biosphere, there's the Buddhist emphasis on the value of life, and this goes on to answer David's question, this morning. And we can cite the texts in support to that, but due to time, I have to go on. And then there is the Buddhist stance on biodiversity, and this is interesting because the texts themselves do not say much at all or anything about biodiversity. Of course, it's a new concept. However, diversity is a natural cause of things. It's a scientific fact, and knowledge of nature is necessary for the practice leading to environment. Knowledge of nature constitutes wisdom, or panya in Pali, which is necessary to lead to eventually to enlightenment. Since nature is good in itself, dharma, as Father Anil said in the morning, and since diversity is part of nature, the latter thus is good in itself, hence it deserves our protection. This is my own take. And we can talk about the methodology of bringing ancient texts, ancient traditions to justify modern measures later on, if you like. So in conclusion, the similarities are many between Buddhism and Hinduism. No single divine authority, even though and here is the difference. We talk about Brahmas and other gods quite a lot, but they are not essential. You don't need them in order to attain enlightenment. And human being is as integral to nature. So another point of similarity, emphasis on cultivating oneself in order to achieve highest good, moksha or nirvana, whatever. This is important. Both traditions share the same kind of argument, I believe, when it comes to environmental ethics. I mean, same kind, to look at things in the broad sense. However, there are contrasts. Hinduism is polytheistic, and Buddhism is, I don't say atheistic, that's not true, but non-theistic. right? At least one school within Hinduism, because I don't know much, at least one school, Advaita Vedanta, believes in the existence of soul, which is directly denied in Buddhism. So not you are that, but what is you? You is a result of relevant causes and conditions. So there's no you, but what you recognize as you is a result of causes and conditions. So that concludes my talk. Thank you.
Actually, Father Samir and I have been discussing this at great length, and sorry. The only thing to kind of clarify a little bit, or one thing, that's me, to clarify is, I do think that there was a sort of profound discontinuity introduced in each of the traditions by modernity. And what I hadn't really studied it as much in the Christian tradition, and Father Samir was kind enough to talk more about that. I think he and I agree that the change was more, in any event, I just want to say that, Father Samir's point was there are continuities with the past. And my idea about it is I'm a little uncertain about that, because as maybe in the earlier generations, at the end of the 18th century and maybe the first part of the 19th century, as modernity began to seep into and define more the context in which a lot of intellectual activity and commercial activity, for that matter, were going on, there were generations of people born who were born into a kind of different way of looking at things. And the difference is very concrete. The difference is now, I think, we see the world in a primary, we look at the world and we see things, because that's the dominant scientific, teaching, is that the world is first, it's things. It's objects, it's empirical stuff that we can see or test or measure or so on, directly or indirectly through instrumentation. The other way of looking at things doesn't, it's like, I think the way I understand the Aristotelian way, for instance, is that when the other point of view is not that we look at matter and then we induce and we go through a complicated process of induction and deduction, and we come up with something we call that's reality, or that's fact, or it's something like that. The other ways of looking at things is that what is primary that we observe is life, not stuff, not inanimate stuff. The primary thing is life. It's living things. That's the more complicated thing. And if we say, I think to some degree, that sensibility, although it's natural, I think it's natural. I just think that as an intellectual matter, as we start, our students go through programs that emphasize science and STEM and all of this stuff, that idea that things are alive and that it's the life itself that we have to deal with that's problematic. If we look at the world and we see life, we see things that are alive, as opposed to looking at the world and saying there's a bunch of inanimate stuff, and that this living stuff is, maybe we don't, some people think that the living things are part of the inanimate nature. Other people can't figure out what's going on because the scientific discourse has confused things dramatically about the relationship between living things and non-living things. Scientific discourse has made living things look like non-living things. Of course, that's what neuroscience says. That's genetic determinism, blah, blah, blah. It's everywhere. So anyway, I think that is the discontinuity that is most disturbing. And I think that is a serious discontinuity. I think it is of profound importance now, and it it makes our modern world very much unlike pre-modern sensibilities in which life is not reduced to the physical world. And, it's just not, that's not the dominant thing.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments from the panel? We can open it up to the Chris, Lucita. Chris.
I would like to make a comment.
Sure. Okay. Okay, sure.
Sorry. Technically on the panel first.
Yes, speak.
The basic problem is that in the Western thought, all that exists in the nature has got a subject-object relationship. Subject can own the objects, they can use them, consume them, exploit them. And those objects are meant for the consumption of man. While in Hinduism, there is nothing like subject-object relationship. It is subject-subject relationship. Everything in the universe has got intrinsic value because they have emerged out of the same cosmic consciousness. So that is why we adore nature. We not only revere them, there is not only reverence, but we adore them, we worship nature. Because it is an expression of that same cosmic consciousness. So we are not subjects and they are objects. There is a subject-subject relationship. As I cited what was written in the book of Genesis, that man has been produced to consume the nature. Of course, many Western thinkers don't agree with that. That's a religious perspective. But that is there. But in our religious philosophy, everything in the nature is a part of the same cosmic consciousness. There has to be an element of synchronization and complementarity. That is the fundamental difference between the Oriental and the Western thought. That is my perception. Thank you.
Hey, Chris.
Yes. Mics are not on. I know I need to use the mic even though I don't use mics. Does anyone have a mic that works over there?
It's okay. No, this one.
Wonderful, thank you. So the people on the screen can hear too. Thank you to all the speakers. They weren't working. It's happening. Thank you to all the speakers. I think John's opening brings up a great framing, and I appreciate Samir's comment. I think the other two panelists, Suraj and Shur's panel, brings up a good dynamic that we have to look at. In my paper, I had argued essentially that sin, and I said it yesterday on my public panel, sin is the root cause of our environmental crisis. But I don't think that's necessarily at odds with the framing of what John said. If we look at modernity, right, I agree wholeheartedly that the pre-moderns in many cultures saw a living world before they saw a world of material objects or a fully objectified world. There's one difference. Modernity ushers in a different framing that it is inescapable. I still think sin, right, in this sense, can be found in all of the movements you bring up. Neoclassical economics is based on avariciousness, right? Greed. It's also based on gluttony. I said that in my presentation. And the emergence of nation states in many ways could be construed as collective egoism and collective arrogance, leading to collective forms of bigotry, right? And scientism, because I won't indict all of science, we disagree, even though I have some sympathies there. It is again human arrogance, desire for domination, right? To me, these forces that you're speaking about, the root cause becomes sin. So my question to John, but to all of the panelists, because the ways in which Gandhi lived, the ways in which we see Buddhism address trying to remedy environmental problems through lifestyle changes that we hear in these presentations. My question then is, are problems not a result of human sin? And humans never actually living according to the teachings of their religious traditions. So even in the past, even in the pre-modern times, the majority of people were not adhering to the tenets of their faiths, the teachings of their faiths. And no one in most Hindus I've met do not engage in subject-to-subject relations. And that's very hard for me to engage this water bottle as a subject, right? So the religious teachings, right, were turned away from, and it is a major turning away that then leads to the environmental destruction. Essentially, it's not at odds with what John said. It's modernity then amplifies the ecological crisis because its systems themselves become rooted in the sin and a full-on turning away from religion, whereas pre-moderns just often didn't live according to it. Could we say that? And that's my question.
So the question implies, you talk about sin. Well, sin is a.
Wait, my concept of sin, of missing the mark of the paradigms of goodness put forth to us by our traditions, not a breach of law. The way I define sin is how I used it. So missing the mark of the vision of goodness.
Okay,
Forget sin, vice.
How about
Human viciousness.
let me make a distinction. The fact that clarify the problem of sin or anything related to vice is that in the non-Abrahamic traditions, in the Abrahamic traditions, the person is born, they live, and they die. End of story. And if they live right, or they did the right thing, whatever, they die, they go to something okay, or they go to purgatory, they go to hell, eternal damnation. The concept comes up all the time. In the other, so sin is a word, all related concepts, even the concept of morality. Or, now I'm citing the virtue, and Elizabeth Anstone talks about the morality having to do with this your the idea of the beginning and the end of God. And if you don't do the right thing, you miss the mark, you do whatever, you die, you go to hell, or you have some problem. There's nothing like that in the other traditions. Therefore, that means in the other traditions, they're not soteriological traditions. And so
So can we just say turning away from their traditions, the teachings of their traditions? Forget vice, forget sin, right? I use that because that is the framing, the viciousness that I think is the root cause of the systems, the modern systems you describe. But fine, right? Is modernity then the product of us fully turning away from the teachings of our faith? I'll back off of all vice and sin.
Back off the idea of faith too, but you said something else. I'll respond to it.
Like,
said that the structures of modernity amplify existing problems among humans and their relationship with nature, so to speak, or their lives. Were they too greedy already? Greed implicit in it. Did modernity exacerbate bad habits, so to speak, or something, destructive habits, self-destructive habits? I would say that makes sense. That's not plausible, but it works. Because what modernity created a structure in which those things had literally became meaningless, right? Under the administrations of other, the metaphysical world or the non-empirical world became meaningless. natural law was out the door, right? Natural law is nonsense on stilts. That's Bentham, 1788. So meaning exactly what you're saying, whatever natural law referring to the idea that there is an inherent right way to do things. Well, after the Enlightenment, right, wrong don't exist anymore. So whatever bad habits there were, then freedom were. So I'd say that's a sounds good to me.
Thank you, John. Well,
Just,
new era.
I think Chris is, fundamentally of an agreement, right? And I think that was sort of, when Pontius by from within the Christian tradition, are you a king? Yes, I'm a king, but my kingdom is not of this world. So I mean, there's a long interpretation, and we can, talk for hours and days and months about what we mean by the concept of the kingdom of God. But there is always, at least within the Christian tradition, and therefore within Europe and the West, this idea of a transcendence, right? I think the fundamental change that occurs with modernity is that becomes entirely human. Right? The kingdom of God, perfection, utopia, the abolition of sin in that sense, the removal of greed, avarice, etc., can be accomplished by man on earth through man's efforts, science, technology, politics, etc. So, yes, I agree. I agree with John and you. It's an amplification, it's an exaggeration, but of an incredible magnitude. And I look, we've come into this workshop, and we've talked about all our different traditions and how our traditions can help us recognize, resolve the ecological crisis. Right? I just think it's important. Just like Joseph asked you the question yesterday, right? What extent do you think Christianity is culpable or responsible? I think that's a question that all of us should ask ourselves, but we also need to recognize the devastating impact of this modern consciousness on the ecological situation in concrete. Right? And then we can look at, okay, how can we try and mitigate that? How can we try and solve that? But it was a huge change. And that's perhaps the major point.
Okay, thank you. Sita?
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to actually get some insight into the Hindu scriptures from Kishore, because it's not something that is easy to access as a Westerner. I think you probably got some of the scriptures still in Sanskrit and not translated yet. Some of them in Hindi, maybe other languages. I just like to know a little bit more about this idea of worshipping parts of creation because they have the qualities of non-possessiveness and non-greediness. I was curious about this, because I've not heard it before. So the idea that the creation is innocent, maybe, and that's why people pray to it, because they see it as more holy than them, more innocent, is not so sinful as they are. Is that what you mean? I don't know. I want to know more about the reason why people pray to animals, trees, rivers. I'm curious. Okay. Can you explain it a bit more? Hear me?
Dr. Kishore, did you hear this? He's having trouble hearing.
Did you hear me? Did you hear what I asked?
He's having a little trouble hearing.
Oh.
The chat box. In the chat box,
Oh.
Can you hear me, Doctor?
I think you have to do it in writing and ask questions in writing.
Maybe for him.
Can you hear me just now?
I think it's that one. Is it that microphone that you hear best?
This little
This one? I think it's that one that you hear best from.
If you guys can come up and ask a question, maybe it might be easier. Dr. Kishore, can you hear me?
Now I can hear you clearly. Otherwise, there's a lot of echo.
There's a lot of echo.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, I can hear you well now.
Okay. No, I was interested in because you only touched upon it, but I'm very interested to hear from the actual Hindu scriptures what Hinduism has to say, and I'd like to hear more. And one of the things was about the worship of rivers, trees, and animals, but the reason being that they have the virtue of non-possessiveness or non-greediness. So to me, this seems like people worshiping or praying to animals as more innocent and more godlike or less sinful than human beings. So they want to get closer to that state of, being more virtuous. So is that what you meant?
Yeah, precisely. You see, the difference between man and other objects in the nature is there is not a single object in the nature, whether it is sentient or insentient, except the human being, who not only use, who not only consume, but they destroy. They are greedy. So nature has sufficient to eat, to feed everybody, but nature does not have to satisfy the greed. So if we are confined our requirements to our need only, and if we shed this greed, which is an inherent trait of Homo sapiens, this greed is not a trait of animals. And of course, the other insentient objects, they are there, they are satisfied with their own existence. So this Homo sapiens has got certain negative traits. And that is why I say that in our ancient Indian thought, they say human beings should worship others because they are more superior. Their existence is not destructive to the nature. They are confined in their own sphere. They don't interfere with anybody. So we worship trees, we worship rivers, we worship animals, we worship stars, we worship sun, we worship clouds, everything we worship. Because they are the only entities in the nature which are so self-contained. They don't eat on our resources, but we destroy, we eat there, and we consume their resources. So that is why I say in our Indian thought, everything is nature, has a relationship which is subject-subject relationship, not subject-object relationship. Over and above that, those entities in the nature which give us, they never expect to take anything from us, they should be worshipped. That is the sentiment behind worshipping cows and elephants and even snakes. And we worship even stones, we worship rivers, we worship sun. Everything in the nature is adorable, we worship them. That is the sentiment.
Thank you. Okay.
So what do you mean by worship? Do you mean
Worship,
asking?
worship.
Are you asking the animal or the creation for something, or you're just admiring it or trying to learn from it?
Worship, there is a difference between respect and worship. Worship always means that we feel that because we are because of them. In their absence, we cannot survive. So we worship them. They have safeguarded and they have sustained our existence. That is why we worship them.
Okay, since we're all here, we could have a very quick encounter, summary, and also projection about what we've been doing and what we're going to do next. So actually, this is a presentation I gave recently at a workshop. It's somewhat of a summary of what we've done so far. As you know, this is an effort that we've started 12 years ago, and has to do with dialogue with different traditions. We call them traditions because John doesn't like the word religion, and cultures. And then it has to do with ethics and bioethics. It has to do with the question of how ethics could be global or universal, or is it particular or local, and how do you bring those two things together? And then we also have to do, because we were UNESCO Chair in Bioethics and Human Rights, has something to do with human rights. And that also goes in the question about are human rights universal or not. And then we've also been discussing about, is this an effort to arrive at some kind of consensus, or do we want some kind of, not consensus is too ambitious, some kind of convergence or common ground, or are we just going to have conversations, right? So this is something that's been ongoing for a while. I just wanted to report to you that this is what we've done in the last 12 years. And so going back in time might give us some more perspectives about what we've accomplished and where we might want to go. So the thing is, when we started this was in 2009. Some of you were there. We also mentioned that at the beginning. David was there, Colleen was there. Not sure who else was there. Maybe Saurabh. I'm not sure if Saurabh was there or not. But that one was really the first few months of the UNESCO chair. It was just approved. So we really didn't have any idea. We just had an idea that we have this area, which is called Bioethics, Multiculturalism, and Religion. And we said, okay, let's do this in Jerusalem for a very practical reason, because there was something else going on in Jerusalem. And since we have no funding, we just latched onto that, and we didn't have to pay for the flights or anything else. Just had to pay for one day. And it was basically really a one-day event. We had speakers. They would just talk about culture of life and religion in the three religions, which is Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. So we had three main speakers and then some other speakers on that topic, but it was just someone giving us a speech, and then we just Q&A, people were questioning and answering. And then at the end of it, we said someone was taking notes, and they would say, okay, let's have a consensus statement. And actually, that was very, very, how should I say, ambitious. So draw all the things together, and then we try to see if there's anything in common. You can still see the conclusion. There was kind of like we said, okay, not consensus statement because it's just a conclusion. And so it would be something that we glean from the three traditions and what they have in common. And it actually was very, very generic, as you can imagine, right? That we love life, we have to respect, we have to be nice, that kind of thing, right? And so it didn't really say very much. But that was our initial attempt to say, okay, how does interreligious dialogue work? So the conclusion was kind of like a common denominator, but it's usually the lowest common denominator. So in some ways, it's kind of like very, not very substantial. And so basically after that, we went back to to Rome, and Alberto and I and Father Miranda were talking about how are we going to go about having these kind of interreligious dialogue. And so we had to think about where, methodology, and who to invite. There was kind of like those are the three main things. And Alberto wanted it to include the Eastern traditions. And I was scared. I said, no, just say the three religions, and this is already enough. But then he was right. And then we did it in Rome because obviously logistically it's easier. At this time, it was on the topic of human vulnerability. And as you can see, the the rest of the encounters was almost every 2 years, except for the pandemic year. And also there was 2014 in Mexico, because they were celebrating the 50th anniversary, so we had to do it in the year. And then most of them were on the article of the UNESCO Declaration of Bioethics and Human Rights. And that's the reason behind that, because we thought these are commonly agreeable principles, articles that are shared at least at the UNESCO level, and they would not be very controversial, right? So that's one reason, since we are still thinking about consensus or convergence, we want things that we could converge on, right? And then the format also changed to be presenting on paper, and the final product was basically publications. And because we felt that if we had a publication, it would be more attractive for the academics, and also will basically make it more substantial, because it's talking about not just talking, but also, you know, have something to go back on, and you have to be able to state what you're saying and where you're coming from. So that was our next event in Rome. And at the same time, we realized that we wanted to, at least that it's going to be a workshop. So we don't really want a big event with a lot of people coming and listening, because it's very difficult to have that dialogue when you have a lot of people. So we basically split the two things. One is the public session, and one would be the main workshop. And the main workshop, we are not concerned about the number of people. If you want to listen in, you're welcome. But and so we have, at the beginning of this thing, about 2 circles, and basically mostly those who are presenting paper who are more academic would have a more substantial conversation among ourselves before we open up to the larger circle. And so we started doing that, and it's actually the methodology kept changing, right? So after the first event, human vulnerability, also we didn't even have the contrast with different religions. That time was basically based on the vulnerable groups, right? And then we talked about the principle, and then the groups, and so on. So that's the thing, and there was not kind of like comparing religions. And the next one, we started to do that. Basically, we had one tradition, and then we had 2 critiques, right? Remember that? You have critique of the same religion, or critiques from another religion. Okay, we've started doing that in Hong Kong. Once again, based on the topics that was forthcoming from the article. It came from the article, but also because we had basically concerns. Basically, for example, when we were doing our discussion of human vulnerability, we realized that the whole question about the UNESCO chair and in bioethics and human rights, and UNESCO Declaration of Bioethics and Human Rights that pretend to be commonly accepted, okay, by all religions, is being challenged. So we actually had a session on relationship between human rights and cultural diversity, which is article number 12. At that time, we had also started to invite speakers, and then even who do we invite is also resolved. Alberto had the idea that we should, at first I would say, okay, let's go to the internet and look at different names and people who are famous and Ivy Leagues, and then we didn't really do that because we didn't have the funding. And then second of all, we realized what was important is also the human touch, like human contact. So what works is basically if we know someone, we've heard them, we introduce ourselves to them, and there's some kind of human touch, then it's easier because then there's rapport being developed, and then we invite people that we know would not be too, how should I say, difficult, right? So that works, except in one place because we didn't know the speakers. Anyway, I won't tell you which one it is. But anyway, so we did that, that methodology, and it worked in Hong Kong. And then we also did it in Mexico City. Houston was the exception because we had to do something more medical, so human genomics. And it's basically the same methodology. Informed consent was different methodology because it was a smaller thing, so we just have 7 speakers and giving the comment they have on informed consent and Q&A. So it didn't have the response tradition. Casablanca was the last one before this one. No, okay, yes. I forgot to mention that. Right. Yes. Yes. Okay, I forgot to mention about that. So one of the things that we noticed was it's the same question that arose, was basically when we have the methodology of one tradition speaking, and then you have 2 response within the tradition and also from another tradition, outside the tradition, to engage. But then what we've found is that usually when this tradition speak, okay, the other tradition has something usually substantial to say to that, right? Respond to it either in agreement or in disagreement or more nuances. But then we find that the second tradition, which respond to this tradition, is usually not engaging enough, right? In the sense that they say, okay, tradition A says this, make a summary, and I said, from my tradition, would look at it this way, right? And it's not very engaging. So one way to facilitate greater engagement was the role of the facilitators that we tried in Houston, which did not work. Did not work for.
It did not work because the facilitator was supposed to read all of the papers ahead of time, look for points of commonality and points of difference, help guide the conversation, right? To explore areas of potential consensus, right? Parameters of permissibility, as I call it, and differences that were irresolvable.
Right.
Our facilitators didn't read shit. Not all of them. Some of them did, right? But some didn't do their job on that sense. It wasn't always the facilitator's fault, though.
No.
The papers didn't come in on time, so it's okay to have nothing to read ahead of time. Right? And then sometimes the facilitators, instead of facilitating, jumped into the conversation with their own totally different perspective, and so that was
yeah. Okay. So that was the past. Yes, I know. Yeah, it was a bump. Yeah. So basically, that was quite exciting. Anyway, we made up after that, so don't worry. There were some heated moments, and then, but in the end, realized that that was demanding too much from the facilitator, because they would have to know the tradition and also the other tradition, and to find bridge concepts. And that was a little bit demanding for a facilitator who might not have, and becomes almost like they had to write another paper almost. I mean, they were supposed to write another paper, none of them did. So basically, there was a bit too much of a demand on the facilitator. So we scrapped that, okay. And in Casablanca, I realized that I have to be the facilitator, okay. So basically, that's what I'm doing there and here. Even though I've read most of the papers, so that's one way of doing it, and I kind of know what they're going. So I don't facilitate in the sense like what you wanted, but at least I'm able to have some kind of time management. Because the other thing was that if you don't have, the facilitator became the person who was managing the time, and they were basically vagrant transgression of time limits. and that became very problematic.
Sole moderator.
Yeah.
is best.
Right, exactly. So, yes, exactly. So I became the moderator. So this is what has happened in Casablanca. At the end of the meeting, some of you might know, a core group of us got together and made a kind of examination of what we've done in the past 10 years and what has worked, what hasn't worked, how to go forward, and so on. So there we had basically came up with 3 commissions. One is to basically, the first one is called the Mission Statement Commission, right? So basically, we were saying, what is it that we're trying to do? So there was a lot of discussion on that. Even though after 10 years, we should know what we're doing, and we don't really know what is exactly wanted to do. There's many different ideas. So there's one commission dedicated to formulating the mission statement. And then the other one was basically methodology. How should we improve on methodology so that there will be a greater engagement, right? So basically, this is the first trial we have of the new methodology. So instead of having one main paper and 2 responses within and without the tradition, basically one tradition speaking, and then the other one doesn't have to represent any tradition, but just as a visitor to a sacred temple. That was the image. And he or she may or may not know about this tradition. He would just visit that place and observe and ask questions like what we did here in the Thai temples, like, what's this? Why is this color? Why? How come there are many? And why do you have that fire-shaped thing on the top, right? So we just keep asking questions. So that's the role of the second author B, now called author B, responding to it. And then basically after you have these 2 papers, the first author can respond to the second paper to write another, like even short one, okay? Jonathan, doesn't have to be so long, so that it doesn't correct. I mean, if you change the first paper, then the second one has his critique would no longer be applicable, and then he has to change his critique, and then you might. That's why we thought that this would be a better way if you could respond back to that person and you say, I have a second thought on this, and then now I think I'm gonna make my position more precise, right? So that's the idea. So this is so the first commission was a mission statement. The second commission was on methodology. The third one was basically something that we haven't applied, which is on the white paper. I'll talk about the white paper later on, but this is basically writing the publication of the book and how we should go about doing the book. So in the book, in the past, okay, we've been quite successful. We've published 6 books in the 7 meetings that we've had with normally Rutledge or Springer, so good publications. And then it's all got my name on it. I'm so sorry. This is not also Alberto's name is on it, so I don't feel so bad. So basically, we're trying to maybe change around, maybe have more people involved, and that has to do with white paper. And those, I mean, it's a lot of work, but then that's to be discussed. Whoever wants to, for example, in the future, take on the role of the editor, most welcome, right? So we'll help you with that, and then we'll look at how we can go around doing that. So that's the idea of the white paper, and the executive summary of the white paper would be kind of the introduction or the conclusion. There was a third commission. So basically, this is the mission statement that we came up with after a little bit of wordsmithing. Basically, there was a lot of we had, after the Casablanca meeting, we had another 4 or 5 Zoom meeting. This is actually on our webpage. You want to look at it. So the mission of the project is to provide a forum in which representatives of diverse religions and traditions, once again, religions and traditions, because John is always insisting that religion is not a good word because of what he said, like religion is it's a colonial term, so he doesn't like it. So that we could engage one another in a sustained scholarly dialogue about global bioethics. So this is what part of it is descriptive about what we've been doing. Okay, part of it is what we would like it to be. Right. So both of them is important. So we've been doing that. We've been engaging each other in a scholarly way, publications, and it's about global bioethics in the sense that this is based on the UNESCO Declaration, and so it's global in that sense. And then cultivate an amicable atmosphere so the participants could learn about each other's tradition or religion with discursive empathy, right? So here, this is also, on the one hand, what we've observed, that there is friendship, right? And instead of going to convergence right at the beginning, we just want to learn and understand what the other tradition has to say, right? And we want to do it with discursive empathy. I think this came from Alan Zhang. So basically, that you're willing to listen, and that when you are not just insisting on your position, but you also want to be empathetic and listen to what the other tradition has to say, right? So once again, the goal of this is to promote understanding through these discussions and scholarship and writing. And then this is for Chris to strive to develop the linguistic and conceptual space in which a common ground or convergence can emerge and be mutually recognized and appreciated. Okay, so there was a big debate about whether we want convergence or if that is too ambitious, or is too ambitious and also ambiguous. Right? That we don't. I was more of the idea to get rid of convergence. Alberto wanted to keep that word in. In the end, we kept it, but it was kind of like moderated. It's no longer as pretentious, right? That we are going to have convergence. We just saying that it is. We're trying to encourage it. Okay, developing a space by which it may emerge or can emerge, right? Through dialogue, through the discussion that this could emerge, and that it could be mutually recognized and appreciated. Right? So this is actually softening the whole concept of convergence, not as a thing that we already possess, but as an ideal that we could foster so that it could come about, right? So, and then the last part would be creative cooperation, whatever that means. So how could we help each other creatively in this workshop? I mean, obviously we're still young. We're around for 10 years. And so this is what we have wanted to do. So this is a mission statement that some of us has come across and come together. Yes.
Comment on.
Sure.
The one thing that seems to be missing to me is the element of practice and practical application. I wonder if there's room for an additional dot point.
Right. So cooperation could mean some kind of application, but we haven't really done that yet because for us, most of us are academics, right? So basically, I'm not sure how many of us are prepared to do something much more concrete than writing papers and publishing books. But obviously, this is included, it's not excluded as a possibility, but that requires a lot more, I guess, at first, what are we going to do physically, right, or practically, and how is that going to manifest itself? Also, yeah. Yeah.
Especially with this particular topic.
Right.
Practical application now, not tomorrow. 20 years
Right.
later, it seems to be highly pertinent, and maybe that's less so than some of the other topics that you've got.
Right. If you know any financial backing of some sorts, I mean, we could explore it. It's always been a difficulty. The way we've been doing this is in every workshop we have had this methodology is that the UNESCO chair supports 50% of the expenses, and then the organizer locally would raise fund for the other 50%.
I wasn't going to for this group.
Okay. No. Right.
I was more meaning that thought be given to appropriate actions that might.
Sure. All right. We could think about how you would want to add that word in here somewhere, right? I mean, foster creator cooperation is very general, right? I mean, in some way, cooperation in that sense is already applicative because, like we already talked about, encountering and talking to each other and listening to each other, and academic publication. So, what other creative cooperation means, other than that, right? So basically, yeah. Lucita?
Yes,
sure.
Father Tam?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Dennis Chang here. Yeah.
Yes.
I'm just wondering, of course, this is a vast sort of multidisciplinary sort of cooperation, collaboration. But I think that increasingly it's realized that we're not just talking about interdisciplinary or even multidisciplinary, but it's transdisciplinary. And it's always more difficult to set up a transdisciplinary team. As you can see, UNESCO recently has been developing principles for a lifelong learning transdisciplinary team for sustainability. And it's just occurs to me there is no mention here as such, although it's implicit, about the need for this transdisciplinary and transcultural rather than simply intercultural sort of cooperation. I'm just wondering whether there is something we should be thinking about. It's quite a recent development, I think, in UNESCO, where they developed this idea of having a transdisciplinary collaboration.
So I just wanted to respond to Paul, because with this topic, right, something more practical and applicable than activist, like seems in order because there's an environmental crisis. But for the topic of neurogenomics, for instance, right, the topic of vulnerability, that's why it's not in. I mean, these were deeply deliberated over, right? And it's to remain open to a variety of different topics that emerge within bioethics and human rights. And unlike a human rights activist group That's not what we are, right? We're not an activist group. So there's the potential for practically applicable ideas to emerge. But some didn't, want consensus or divergence, some wanted more conversational approach. And if it's a conversational approach and visitation about learning about other traditions, then there's no practical applicability in the activist sense that would emerge from that. So this keeps it open to different topics and for different explorations. Maybe two thinkers, right? The way in which paper A and B engage will be more of a visitation, and maybe others will be, but Deep agrees with me, and then I respond, okay, let's reform what contemporary bioethics is, and something grows out of that because someone reads our chapter. So we try to keep it open on these committees. I just wanted to. Yeah, it's a great concern, but then it's like how do you get practically an activist in those topics? Sorry.
Okay. Dennis, about your question. It's already, the words may not be there, but the whole concept is.
It's implicit. It's implicit there. But they do make this distinction nowadays between intercultural and transcultural.
Right.
And multidisciplinary and transdisciplinary. And in fact, there's sort of practical norms. There's a framework, a sort of structure being developed. And they find that it's more expensive, actually. It's more difficult to do a transdisciplinary than to do just an interdisciplinary sort of research team. And they find it's necessary to do that, particularly for sustainability studies.
Right.
And they've got a lifelong sort of learning process there. It's useful to have a look at what they are now developing. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So basically, we go to the last slide. One thing is that UNESCO has asked us to change our logo. So this is a new logo for those of you. Even our internet has not been updated, but in the future we have to use this logo instead of the old logo for what we are doing. So we can ask Serena if necessary for the change in logo. We also in the process of revamping all our previous or web page. Future topics. There is already one I forgot to mention. It's not going to be the same one. There is a topic on fratelli tutti. Some of you were contacted last year, but then it didn't work out because of the pandemic. So probably be a smaller one, like a mini workshop once again. Basically, hopefully will be just 7 speakers commenting on fratelli tutti as a document and seeing, especially in the last section, which is on interreligious dialogue, right? So this is a possibility. Yes. Is it? Well, it could fall under this, but it's not really this format, the workshop format. That's why I didn't put it in here, right? But then for the real this format, we have 2 or 3 topics that has come into the fore. One is on death and immortality. I think we mentioned that last time because it seems to be is no longer. Once again, we're moving away more from the articles of the UNESCO Declaration because first 6 of the articles, there are not many other ones that we could actually do. And the other hand is like now we can do things that are not so dependent on the UNESCO Declaration. So we could explore other things as well. And these are the topics that we thought are more relevant. One is these are very interesting religious topic on death and mortality. Most religions would have a certain view on death, immortality, and bioethics. So basically both the question about euthanasia, but mostly from the death perspective, or transhumanism from perspective of immortality, and the yearning, I mean, of these meaning of life questions. I think it's very appropriate for religions to confront these issues. John has something to ask.
It seems to me that death and mortality might be
Right.
but then AI and death, because all of the AI stuff is an intense focus from AI and mortality.
Right. 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 Okay, yeah, I mean, it's open-ended, so AI and mortality is interesting. The other one, yes, another question is that came up talking to, I think it was David Aid. The other he was thinking about medicine and illness and medicine as a topic, because most religions or cultures rather, right, the Chinese culture, the Hippocratic culture, Roman, Islam culture, all have different traditions or development on meaning of medicine and healing and all that. But that could be another topic that could be quite substantial, right? Sometimes the thing about the topics we choose, sometimes they could be too, how should I say, difficult for some traditions to come up with resources, right? So, for example, AI, most religions, like, they might find that, oh, what are we going to talk about? Like, it's kind of like AI and Hinduism. It's like, well, yeah, I know. Right. So anyway, we've done already two technical things, which is reproduction and neurogenomics. So we don't want to overlap either, right? So basically those questions are already like reproduction and genomics has to do with future generation. So anyway, we still have to keep thinking about it, but that at least is also linked to the venues, right? So basically people who are interested in sponsoring, interested in that topic in particular. So basically Cambridge is interested in death and immortality. So we have this contact. Yes, John.
Yes, Father, yes, sorry. Father Tam,
yes.
On AI and on humanities, techno-humanities, that is a topic that I'm interested in only because I'm, of course, council chair of the CIHE, the Caritas, the Future St. Francis University.
Right.
And we have started, as you know, we have started techno-humanities, which is a sort of world-class center. There are only one other center at the moment. And so the AI is part of that, but it is techno-humanities. And that is a very interesting, a very exciting sort of subject. And I'm just wondering whether there's any chance of you coming back, as you were, to Hong Kong to do a symposium, because I'm quite sure that the CIHE would be very interested if you are doing a topic on AI and techno-humanities. Yeah.
We can talk about that. Yeah. Yes, Alberto. You because he cannot hear you with you.
This is also brainstorming for other topics that I put on the table. Barney mentioned public health ethics and bioethics, and
Yes.
because of the need to emphasize in the UNESCO Declaration of Bioethics and Human Rights, the social dimension, and how to build that bridges between public health ethics and bioethics, taking the last 5-6 articles of the declaration that focus more on an individual but in the society. And I think also moves easily as a topic in respect of other of these topics where the different traditions is more difficult to find and to do the research we can do it.
Right. Even though we've done one on social responsibility in health.
Yeah, but
So
I'm not
there's
sure
a
if
little
this is the same thing.
Right.
That body was mentioned, but anyway.
Yeah.
Brainstorm.
Okay. Yes, Jonathan.
A couple of ideas. One would be psychedelics. And
Magic mushrooms.
yes, that it is going to be changing how we take care of PTSD and other kinds of recalcitrant psychological issues. So religious traditions do have some concern, and also some, not just concern, there's ambivalence, there's also embracement in many religious traditions for use of psychedelics. And so that could also, we can talk more broadly about not just psychoactive drugs, but about sacred drugs. And many religious traditions have this idea that there are certain kinds of drugs that are sacred. So that might be an interesting topic for us to explore.
Interesting, yeah.
Father Tan.
Yes.
I'm also interested in the topic AI. It's because recently I have worked, read some things on AI, and have a dialogue with my son who is doing working on AI as well. And I think this topic is important and has a huge ethical implication for humanity. And so I echo with Dennis topic.
Thank you. Badit.
Before we get off the topic, I sit on the board of a psychedelic startup that's trying to develop microdosing pills to use first in research and then clinically. And the reason they asked me to be on the board is they're concerned that as they work on these developments, they will respect traditions. They don't want to be seen as exploiting traditional ways of knowing and traditional practices for the sake of profit in a way that disregards what Indigenous peoples and traditions have to offer. So I don't know if you've ever thought of sponsoring a workshop in partnership with a commercial entity. I know this is fraught with issues, but because I have this contact, it's just an opportunity to, and again, they are interested in this kind of feedback in order to have corporate social responsibility as they go forward. So I'm just putting, I think this is a fantastic topic, and I'm just putting it out there as a potential source of funding, but also a potential real contribution into an industry that is obviously going to explode over the next few years.
Good, very interesting. We'll keep in touch and see where that goes.
Could I suggest something?
Yes.
Do you think it's useful to discuss the internet and how that is, how much we can actually control this information and hate speech and things like that?
Right.
And algorithms. I think that's something that any religious discourse should have a say on. That any, like we have things in Islam where we talk about investigating carefully and ensuring that things are truthful and things like that, but and minimizing harm. So maybe in other positions there be things which will help to kind of get an ethical stance on.
Right. Yeah. Like the whole thing about social media, about
ethics.
It's
social media ethics. It's getting away from bioethics.
Yeah, I mean, it's not too far off. I think it's a very current topic. Fertility talks about that a little bit. Talks about the question of, in some way, question of polarization today, and about the media and the divide of opinions becoming very violent and all that. So that's very interesting. I think we could explore that for sure. Yes,
Yes, I'm quite new to here, but lately I have been working closely with Thai government. And one of the points we have been under community for all these ministers, the different ministers, they are in Thailand, they are quite interested in the whole idea of the idea it was the legacy from the late Majestic King, subsistence economy. So in a way that is the idea of sufficiency, because after the SDG, so what will be the agenda, we don't know yet. But the Thai government, they are talking about that. Is there any way that we can have this sufficiency, the idea of sufficiency from the world in that sense? So if it is one of the topic, we can is at the table for this kind of a group. I guess that from the sponsorship, I can easily get.
So what was the topic? Sufficiency?
Yeah, the equilibrium, the whole idea of sufficiency. Yeah, sustainability and kind of is a different term. Yeah. Because the king used the word sufficiency economy.
In the West, we use, I think, mostly sustainability.
Yeah.
So the question of sustainability.
It is kind of a more as a small is beautiful.
Not having extravagance.
Yes.
Right?
It's just kind of a balancing between your greed and your need.
Okay. So we're basically the spirit of poverty for us, right? Spirit of poverty. Right. Okay, that's an interesting topic. Maybe is there a number in the UNESCO declaration on that? No. Sufficiency. Okay. Right. Interesting. Yeah.
Sorry, Father Tan, Dennis Cheng here. Just on the, I mean, this time, is this the first time that we actually have a hybrid, which is online and at the same time a physical meeting? Is that right?
That's correct.
I'm just wondering whether, I mean, the future is definitely going to be digital, but not only digital, it is also biological and ecological. But the digital side, I'm wondering whether you could actually expand your participation by having hybrid. But of course, there's a danger in that once you have that, you may have fewer people actually physically going there. But I don't think so. I think that you will still have people really wanting to go and attend, because it's a different thing. I mean, it's, you know, but you could enlarge the participation by introducing, by allowing online participation. Is one, at least something to think about. And also, I wonder whether you could have breakout sessions where this is supposed to be a workshop. So if it's a workshop, you work, and if you have breakout sessions, you get people coming back and reporting on particular points, and maybe that's one way of something worth considering.
Yes,
rather than,
the thing about our workshop, I mean, even though we call it workshop, is really maybe it's more like a symposium than a workshop.
Yeah, I know it's called a workshop at the moment, you see.
Right.
So yeah.
And about the hybrid, I'm not too convinced about it, because obviously I think the conversation goes beyond the presentations. A lot of times happens in the downtime, and we're missing a lot of that this time with the the Taoist and the Confucian, because they could not come. So it was kind of impoverished.
I mean, it's a great pity.
Yeah. So I think we'll strive to make it more in person because of the nature of it.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously even this time we had it opened for the internet, but we didn't see a lot of outsiders coming in and participating. So I'm just wondering, because of the technical nature of our discussions,
Yes.
that it actually works better in person than by virtually. So this is still my
It's not for town hall meeting as well. I mean, if you have a meet the public session,
right.
But they are really select representatives, are they not? I mean,
right.
It's not as if you are talking to the people.
Right, right, exactly. So the conversation and the engagement seems easier in person, face to face, than by internet. We had, I mean, originally there was just like you and someone else, and then more and more and more. In the end, we had 10 people, and that also a temptation not to present yourself in person because of the fact that you could like it's more.
Yes, we still have to date 5,000 new cases every day. So hopefully the COVID would subside.
Right.
And
2 years time.
Sure. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
But anyway, it's a even participating online, we're so used to it now. I mean, it's almost like the new normal.
Okay. Yes.
Just came to my mind that actually the word substance economy, the late king used it. And just before the late king passed away, was just 2 months before, prior to his death, actually he used the word kind of thing like economy of happiness. The one he used.
Okay.
Economy of happiness.
Yes, Jonathan.
Father, just one question I'm dying to ask you. Today, there's this neti, not here, and neither. But when it comes to all here, or we don't have the Sanskrit name. I've been trying to find it. I wonder whether somebody can give an answer.
Dennis, you just cut off Jonathan, and that's exactly why having people on Zoom doesn't work when it's not a pandemic situation, an emergency situation. You need face-to-face, real encounter where we're breathing in the same room, where we're breathing the spirit and the air together. We're unmasked in here, and we hope COVID will go away soon enough that we can all come back and have this fellowship, this symposium, because every time I went to speak, someone has cut me off. It just happened to Jonathan. I'm glad it's not just like a jab at me. So it doesn't work like that. And the conversations can't carry over. Rudy Ping and I would be laughing for days, telling jokes. I miss it. I can't do that. So it really changed the dynamic here, and I had to interrupt because this is exactly one of the reasons why we can't have it hybrid going into the future if it's not an emergency situation. Sorry, but thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Jonathan, you were going to say something, yeah.
Thank you. Can we also talk about other things besides just context?
Sure.
Topics? So one other idea for a future topic that's also relevant to many populations around the world would be addiction. So is that even an intelligible concept according to religious traditions? And if so, what do they have to say about it? So I'll just put that on the table for another topic. Future venues, I really hope that we'll put Africa on this conversation and South America. There are other parts of the world. We're already in Southeast Asia. South India would be South Asia would also be lovely, but there are other parts of the world. And we've talked about this idea, the need for diversification of the people who are involved in this conversation. I think especially if local knowledge and local people, local traditions are going to be invited. We need to model that. Speaking of modeling, Insofar as this whole conference was a conversation about environmental impact, I think it would be fantastic if this group made the voluntary commitment to model what religious people who take religion seriously, what we can do in our collectives for minimizing our environmental impact. So for example, with bringing this activist spirit to life, we make a commitment that when we gather for these conferences, that we try to have the least environmentally degradationally environmentally bad diet. So why don't we make the better food choices for our group? So, for example, the Society for Jewish Ethics, of which I'm a member, made the commitment many years ago that whenever we meet, we will always have vegan meals, because vegan meals are the least environmentally bad dietary option. Why can't we? What prevents us for 3 days making the commitment to model to ourselves, to each other, to our colleagues and families and our communities, that we take the environment seriously, and that when we meet, we're going to try and do that, at least through our dietary choices, that the host community provide us the least bad options.
I want to second that, Jonathan, but not on necessarily just diet, because something like this conference, right? Like the water bottles are empirically bad, right? So we should even have just a water cooler so that we can all fill our reusable water bottles. With the diet, something like veganism, if it's monocultural soybeans, right? Veganism is not necessarily, it's not necessarily lower carbon than local land, right? There's a number of studies.
What are the best, the
but
least
yeah.
worst options available?
But-
Let's put it that way.
So, I mean, making an effort to be local with the food, it also seems easier, and localism is also environmentally sustainable. And maybe just like say no plastics, right? Or something like that. But I like the spirit of where you're going with that. Yeah.
But I'd like to comment that, we change topics on meeting to meeting, and if we do psychedelics, does that mean you're gonna come here and try psychedelics?
And they're vegan. They're vegan.
One, the papers that we've written, if I didn't know I couldn't change it, I would have spent a lot more time on it. So if we can make some changes, as long as the criticism still bite, that would be very helpful. So mine is typo, it's all over the place.
No, I think if it is a non-substantial change, right? It would be kind of like, you know what I'm saying, right? If it is a substantial change, then maybe it's better to put it in the,
Right, good.
yeah, because if it's just like cosmetic, then that's better. But if it's substantial idea, it's critique, because if you change something based on suppose the second author's critique, then his critique no longer applies, and that makes the second paper like almost bad. You know what I'm saying?
No, I get that.
Yeah. So that's the idea. It's actually in the methodology there talk about that.
But
Yeah.
I would go down to that. As we say, Africa is a big continent because people.
Yes. Right.
An interesting topic might be the issue of irreversible things. Irreversibility, think about germline modification.
Yeah.
Nature. There might be some mixed layers. And then I would say methodologically, you might think some about how we spend the precious time we have in the group together. And I got the impression that maybe the way it was decided who was talking during Q&A wasn't designed to maximize voices. It wasn't necessarily reflecting what most people in the room cared about. Not that it wasn't, but that the way we decided who was talking and for how long seemed to be
raise a hand first who would look passionate, things like this. So I think we could think about something, and this is minor, and I'll move on. I may be going against what I said I should do, but some way to collect written questions in a way that the moderator could then see if there were patterns.
Okay.
Yes. The ones that most people seem to care about.
Yeah. One finger, 5 fingers.
Yeah, I would like to comment a little bit on Jonathan's proposal for vegan news for us. It actually depends on the location, and in some location where the caterer, the host doesn't know actually how to do vegan food, it can be difficult and can impose some kind of burden on them and increase the cost of the operation. So if we go to a Chinese temple in Hong Kong, for example, where they eat vegetarian meals all the time, that's easy. But in some other places, they don't, for example, in Japan, outside of the Buddhist temples, they would have a hard time preparing vegetarian or vegan meals for us. So we have to put the location into consideration. But I enjoy vegan food, as long as it's good. In that case, we need to factor in the location.
Yes, was
Right, I think I probably had more than my fair share of turns in this seminar, whatever you put. But just one more topic, which I think is very important, is economic justice. So how do you achieve economic justice? And I think African speakers would be very interested in it, and how we can achieve economic justice better.
Yeah, we're constrained also by bioethics. So we are trying to stay in bioethics. The question about Africa is also financial in some way, because to now politics system that we support 50% and then local 50%. So actually, even though we had a partner in Africa, they've not been able to raise funds at all. So we have not been able to do anything with them. We would really love to do something with them. But I think in that case, we probably have to raise 100% of the expenses and then do it in Africa, which for us, unless we find a benefactor, some funding, which is possible. I mean, we think about it, we might want to do that. Yes. Yeah, Casablanca. Yeah. Yeah, but it's more open. Yes.
The International Association of Bioethics just approved a new network, the Africa Bioethics Network, that really collects bioethics from many countries across the continent, including South Africa, that has more resources than others. But I think that if there's a desire to go to the continent through the network, it might be much easier to identify partners that can raise the funds. So I'm offering that.
Sure. Okay, I think everyone is a little bit tired. There's a lot of ideas. I want to say something about methodology. I was wondering if, since part of the goal is that we get to know other traditions, why not, we talked about this, but now I'm suggesting it again, why not do some kind of ranked choice situation where we, oh, I'm sorry. Sorry. Why don't we, select our topic and then we have our disciplines and do a ranked choice selection where we're prohibited from doing our native thing. Like I would be prohibited from doing Hinduism and I have to pick another discipline. But since we're there, it's limited, we need to do 3 people per discipline. For instance, you do ranked choice selection, and then at the end you have people who everybody is doing something they're interested in, but not their own thing.
They have to find something else. And if you get to choose on a ranked choice thing, you never, you're gonna pick somebody, something you want to do, and you're likely to get it.
Okay, next time I will insult you what you want to comment on.
Can I propose the topic?
Yes.
And John did not pay me for this. Really, given everything that just happened with vaccines and anti-science across the world, be it religious traditions, cultural traditions, religions in favor of vaccinations, against them for certain vaccinations, something that fits with our bioethics is the relationship of religion, culture, and science as a framing issue. We have illness and medicine up there. It's something that's always running in the background. I will say I was very disappointed, and it's not a blame on anybody. I know it was late in the game and we were long days. We didn't get into that conversation right now. After John's talk, the nature of science, modern science. We're talking about medicine. That was a very good topic. David and I were chatting about it. How we can, you and David and I were also chatting about it. There'd be a lot of ancient wisdom coming to the topic of medicine.
Right.
But on modern science, it would give us a chance to have 3 days dedicated to really hashing that out. And I think that's one of those issues that's underlying a lot of our symposia workshops, whether it's neurogenomics or healthcare, the types of healthcare delivery. So I'd like to propose that topic on the table, religion, culture, and science as a topic.
Thank you. Good, we can keep the conversation going. Still have some time here. Until tomorrow. Those of you who are still around. So I think once again, I'd like to thank the organizers from the Children of Hong Kong University, and the dream team, I don't know where they are. For the dream team. For their service and hospitality, and then also for our and also for actually from the Master Chair Selena, and also from the commission, the speakers and all the staff in these last 3 days. And is anyone I forget? Obviously, the organizers from Rome, but then also the participants, for the patients, and for their comprehension for all the difficulties and things that always don't went so smoothly. Anyway.
And we want to thank you for the building and the department.
All right. Okay, adjourn the meeting, and thanks for the patience and the participation. See you, Dennis.